Ethan and I were childhood sweethearts, brought together by an arranged marriage between our prestigious families. After our wedding, we lived harmoniously as husband and wife. In an unexpected accident, he even gave up his only chance of survival for me. After Ethan passed away, we found a diary among his belongings. Inside, it recorded the 3 years he had lost his memory after falling off a cliff, years in which he had deeply loved another woman. In the end, his parents forcibly separated them and arranged our marriage. All those years, in a place where no one knew, he had silently protected that girl. At the funeral, his mother was devastated with grief. "Ethan, it's all my fault. If I had let you marry Lily back then, would you still be alive now?" His father looked at me with hatred. "He fell off that cliff trying to save you. Now, he protected you with his life in that car accident. Why do you keep bringing him pain? Why wasn't it you who died instead? Yes, why wasn't it me?" I stared at his tombstone, at the engraved image of Ethan's gentle smile. Then, I slammed my head against it. When I opened my eyes again, I had returned to the moment when he was first brought back from that small fishing village. This time, I would let him go. After 2 lifetimes, I was once again standing in front of Ethan. "Miss, aren't you going over?" the butler gently reminded me from behind. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to put on a polite smile, and walked toward him slowly. Every step felt like walking on the tip of a blade. Scenes from my past life flashed before my eyes, how he pushed me away at the last moment before the car crash, how his diary was filled with pages and pages of longing for Lily, how in his sleep, he unconsciously murmured the name Ethan. I softly called out to him. He turned around, his gaze flickering with momentary confusion before he quickly put on a polite yet distant smile. "Long time no see." I noticed the shell bracelet on his right wrist, shimmering warmly under the sunlight. It was a gift from Lily. In my past life, I had never paid attention to such a small detail, but now it felt like a sharp thorn in my heart. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. "The doctor said my memory hasn't fully recovered yet." He rubbed his temples. "A lot of things are still blurry." I watched the tiredness in his expression and suddenly remembered something he had written in his diary from my past life. "Every time I see Lily picking up shells by the shore, I feel like she is the most beautiful scenery in this world." So the boy who once loved me had long since been captivated by another sight. The next morning, Mrs. Carter gathered the entire family to discuss the wedding arrangements. I sat beside Ethan, watching as he absent-mindedly flipped through the wedding plans, his long fingers unconsciously drawing circles on the pages. "Ethan, what do you think of this venue?" Mrs. Carter asked. He lifted his head, his gaze flickering with hesitation. "They all look fine." I noticed how his eyes would drift toward the window every now and then. Outside, a vibrant rose garden was in full bloom. In my past life, I thought he was simply admiring the scenery, but now I understood. He was reminiscing about the wildflower-covered hillside in the fishing village. "I think the rose garden is a good choice," I said softly. "Let's have the wedding there." He suddenly turned to look at me, a trace of surprise flashing in his eyes. I gave him a gentle smile, even as my heart bled. I had already booked my flight to leave the country on the day of our wedding. In my past life, my dream had been to travel the world, but I had never been able to make it happen due to various obligations. Later, when Ethan finally made time to go with me, we ended up in that fatal car accident. He gave his life to save me. This wedding would be my final gift to him. "Ethan should be the one to pick out the wedding dress with Sophia," Mr. Carter said. "We'll leave it up to you young people to decide." Ethan stood up and extended his hand toward me. I looked at his slender fingers and recalled how, in my past life, these same hands had written down his love for another woman. I will never forget the way Lily stood at the dock, the sea breeze lifting the hem of her floral dress as she cried so heartbreakingly. Sometimes, when I look at the person beside me, I wonder, if I had never lost my memory, if I had never met Lily, would my life be different now? Those words were like daggers, cutting my heart open and leaving it bleeding. I smiled sweetly and took his arm. I could feel his body stiffen, but I pretended not to notice. Then, I got into the car. I gave an address, the most upscale bridal boutique in the city. In my past life, I had spent an entire day there trying on wedding dresses, convinced I was the happiest bride in the world. I heard they just got a new collection of wedding dresses. Let's go check them out, I said, tilting my head to look at him. Ethan, what kind do you like? His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Whatever you like is fine. I held back my tears and turned to look out the window. Ethan, in this lifetime I won't marry you. While trying on wedding dresses, we ran into another girl who was also shopping for hers. She wore a simple, yet elegant mermaid gown that accentuated her delicate figure. When she saw us enter, her gaze lingered on Ethan for a brief moment before she enthusiastically greeted me. What a coincidence! Are you here to try on dresses too? She approached with an easy familiarity. I'm Lily, I'm getting married next month. I studied her. She had expressive eyes that seemed to speak on their own, and when she smiled, the corners of her eyes lifted slightly, carrying a hint of charm. In my past life, how had I never noticed the emotion in her gaze whenever she looked at Ethan? Yes, I responded with a smile. I'm Sophia, and this is my fiancé. Lily's eyes flickered back to Ethan, lingering a little longer this time. Ethan stood beside me, his expression slightly dazed. My fiancé treats me so well, Lily said, grabbing my hand as she eagerly continued. He remembers the exact day we first met. Every month he sends me a bouquet of white roses. Just last week, I casually mentioned wanting a cake from that bakery in Chinatown, and he went out of his way after work to buy it for me. I noticed Ethan's fingers curling slightly, his usual reaction when his emotions were turbulent. In my past life, I thought it was just nervousness about our wedding. But now I understood, he was suppressing something much deeper. And you? Ethan suddenly spoke, his voice slightly hoarse. Do you love him? Lily froze, her bright smile faltering for a split second. She instinctively glanced at Ethan, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes. Oh, of course I do, she answered hastily, forcing her composure, but her fingers twisted at the fabric of her dress. Ethan let out a quiet scoff, his gaze sharpening. I stood there, keeping my expression calm as I watched everything unfold. How blind had I been in my past life to miss the tension between them? After the fitting, Ethan made an excuse about work and left in a hurry. I pretended to need the restroom, but secretly followed him. In the parking lot, I saw Ethan grab Lily and press her against the wall, kissing her fiercely. At first, she struggled slightly, but soon she melted into his embrace. You don't love him, Ethan's voice was thick with suppressed rage. So why are you marrying him? Lily's voice trembled with tears. And what about you? Aren't you getting married too? It's not the same, Ethan's voice dropped, quieter now. Then they clung to each other once more. It felt as if an invisible hand had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart so tightly I could barely breathe. I staggered back a few steps, leaning against the cold wall as tears spilled uncontrollably from my eyes. I suddenly remembered when I was 5 years old, the first time Ethan came to visit my home. He had worn a tiny suit, looking like a little gentleman, as he took my hand and, in his soft, childish voice, said, Sophia is so pretty. When I grow up, I'm going to marry you. Back then, he didn't know what arranged marriages were. He had simply liked me. He would search the entire city for a hair accessory I liked. I still remembered the time I had set my heart on a crystal hairpin displayed in a store window. Without hesitation, he had dragged his driver all over town, looking for the exact same one. By the time he finally found it in a small, tucked-away shop, his little leather shoes had been worn down from running around. Whenever I was sick with a fever, he would secretly sneak into my room and stay by my bedside all night. One time, when the adults caught him, he had stubbornly declared, I have to take care of my future wife. It had made Uncle Carter so furious he stomped his foot in frustration. Every holiday, he meticulously planned surprises for me. On Christmas, when we were 10, he once handcrafted a music box for me. Inside, there was a photo of the two of us. When the key was wound, it played the melody of Für Elise. He said it was our token of love and asked me to treasure it. On my 16th birthday, he planted a cherry blossom tree in my backyard. He said that when we got married, we would hold our wedding beneath it. Back then, his eyes saw only me. When I returned home, I burned every memory of us. I stood in the backyard, staring at the cherry blossom tree that had now grown into a towering giant. I doused its base with gasoline. Flames roared to life, illuminating my face with a crimson glow. All those youthful promises, all those beautiful memories, turned to ash within the raging fire. I threw the music box into the flames and watched as it slowly melted. One by one, I cast in every gift, every keepsake that once held meaning. Finally, I took out the engagement ring. The diamond gleamed coldly in the firelight, just like the way Ethan had looked at me in the end. Without hesitation, I tossed it into the fire and watched as the flames consumed it. When the fire finally died out, all that remained was a pile of ashes. I stood amidst the ruins, feeling lighter than I ever had before. The memories that bound me, the past that tormented me, had all vanished with the smoke. The wedding preparations were in full swing. Because the arrangements required a lot of manpower, many new staff members had been hired. Among them was Lily. Ethan was visibly stunned when he saw her. I stood on the second-floor balcony, watching the scene unfold in the grand hall below. Lily was wearing a simple white dress, her long hair draping over her shoulders as she filled out an employment form. As Ethan walked past her, his footsteps faltered for just a moment. "This is our new wedding planning assistant, Miss Lily," the HR manager introduced. Lily lifted her head, locking eyes with Ethan. I saw his fingers tremble slightly, a telltale sign of his emotional turmoil. "Welcome," Ethan said, his voice slightly hoarse, before quickly striding away. I quietly followed behind him, watching as he slipped into a storage room. Not long after, Lily went in as well. Standing outside the door, I heard muffled sobs from within. "Why?" Lily's voice quivered. "Why are you doing this to me?" "Little Lily?" Ethan's voice was thick with pain. "I'm sorry." Peeking through the gap in the door, I saw Ethan holding Lily tightly in his arms. Their lips were swollen, glaringly red, evidence of a passionate kiss just moments before. The scene was like a dagger, stabbing deep into my heart. I thought I had numbed myself to the pain, yet I hadn't expected it to feel so sharp, so real. The next day, Lily clumsily lost my most treasured talisman, a smooth jade pendant. It was the same pendant Ethan had once endured unimaginable hardship to obtain for me. I had been gravely ill back then, and he had climbed over 3,000 temple steps to pray for my recovery. I remembered that day vividly. He had left at 4 in the morning, slipping out quietly, while I lay feverish in bed. I drifted in and out of sleep, only waking deep into the night when I heard the faint creak of the door. He had returned, drenched in sweat, the knees of his pants tattered and worn. "Sophia?" He knelt beside my bed, carefully pulling a small sandalwood box from his pocket. "I got you a protective charm." I forced my weak eyes open and saw his pale face breaking into a smile. His hands were covered in scrapes, and his knees were stained with blood. "They say this temple is very spiritual," he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. I climbed on my knees. "Sincerity makes all the difference, right?" As I gazed into his exhausted yet gentle eyes, tears welled up uncontrollably. "Don't cry," he whispered, gently wiping away my tears. "You'll get better. I made a wish to Buddha to exchange my health for your safety." I clenched the pendant tightly, feeling the warmth of the jade against my skin. At that moment, I truly believed that this charm would protect me, and it did. My illness eventually faded away, but Ethan began to fall sick more often. He always laughed it off, saying, "Looks like Buddha really heard my wish." I closed my eyes, and in my mind, I saw him again, that teenage boy kneeling on the temple steps, climbing upward with unwavering devotion. His knees were scraped raw, his palms bruised and bloodied, yet he never stopped. Back then, he truly loved me, didn't he? Now the pendant that carried our most precious memories was gone, carelessly lost by Lily. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sullivan," Lily stammered, her voice trembling with panic, eyes red with unshed tears. I'll go look for it right away." I watched her pitiful act and scoffed internally. She did this on purpose. I had noticed from the very first day she joined the staff, how her gaze lingered on the pendant with an unsettling intensity. Ethan stood nearby, his brows tightly furrowed. "How could you be so careless?" His tone sounded like a reprimand, but I knew the truth. He never really cared about this pendant. "It's fine," I said softly. "If it's lost, then it's lost." Ethan hesitated for a moment, seemingly surprised by my indifference. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but in the end all he managed was, "I'll get you another one someday." I looked at him, There was no anger in my eyes, no sadness, only deep exhaustion and quiet acceptance. At this moment, I had to admit it. The boy who once knelt on temple steps for me, who stayed up all night when I was sick, who ran through the entire city to find me a hairpin, he was gone. That Ethan would never return. "There's no need," I said before turning away. "Some things, once lost, are lost forever." Behind me, I heard Lily's muffled sobs. Ethan seemed like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he simply turned and ran after her. I stood by the window, watching as the two of them disappeared down the villa steps. The sunlight was bright and warm, but it no longer reached my heart. Ethan's memory was gradually returning. The treatment was working. The day before the wedding, he suddenly stopped what he was doing, his gaze falling on me and lingering there for a long time. "Sophia," he called my name softly, hesitation laced in his voice. "Lately, I feel like I've been remembering things." His tone became more serious. "Do you still have that music box I gave you? The one with our photo inside?" I looked up at him, his eyes filled with anticipation, and a sharp pain stabbed through my chest. That music box had long since turned to ashes when I burned away all our memories. Forcing a faint smile, I whispered, "I lost it." His expression dimmed for a moment, but he quickly masked it with calm indifference. "It's okay. I'll buy you another one." I didn't respond, only silently watching him. His gaze no longer held the same coldness as before. There was warmth now, even traces of guilt. But I knew this warmth wasn't meant for me. His heart already belonged to someone else. He walked over to the window, his eyes settling on the empty space in the backyard. His brows furrowed slightly. "The cherry blossom tree," he murmured. "I remember there used to be one here." I stepped up beside him, my voice steady. "The workers accidentally cut it down during renovations." His fingers drummed lightly against the window frame, his expression briefly flickering with unease before he quickly regained his composure. "Then let's plant a new one," he said. "It's the perfect season for it." I nodded, not rejecting the idea. He took my hand and led me outside. Eagerly, he grabbed tools and began digging into the soil. "Sophia, do you remember?" he said with a small smile. "When we were 16, this was the exact spot where I planted the cherry blossom tree." As he dug the hole, he continued talking, his voice carrying a nostalgic warmth. "Back then, you said you wanted to have our wedding under this tree when we got married. I promised you that every year, when the cherry blossoms bloomed, I'd watch them with you." I looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the boy he used to be. Back then, his love for me was real. But now, his love for someone else was just as real. He placed the cherry blossom sapling into the freshly dug hole and looked up at me, his gaze tender. "A tree can be replanted. Our love can too, right?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Just then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his brows knitting together before silencing the call. But a few seconds later, it rang again. He pressed decline once more, his irritation evident. "Pick it up," I said softly. "It might be important." He hesitated, but eventually answered. From the other end came Lily's tearful voice. I couldn't make out her words, but I saw Ethan's face change instantly. His expression tightened, and he quickly hung up. "Sophia, I have to go. Something urgent came up," he said hurriedly. "Don't worry, I'll finish planting the tree tomorrow." I nodded, watching as he rushed off, his figure disappearing into the fading light of dusk. I knew he was going to find Lily. Standing still, I turned to look at the half-planted cherry blossom sapling. For the first time, I felt nothing. There would be no future for Ethan and me. Tomorrow was our wedding day, and I had already booked my flight out of here. This time, I wouldn't look back. 6 years later, a close friend invited me back home for a class reunion. In the past 6 years, I had traveled across the world, from the glaciers of the Arctic to the grasslands of Africa, from the rainforests of South America to the beaches of Australia. My writing had become a best-selling success, and my photography had won international awards. I had finally become the person I wanted to be, free, independent, and full of life. The reunion was set at an upscale restaurant. I wore a simple white dress, light makeup, yet I still became the center of attention. My former classmates gathered around, eager to hear my stories from around the world. "Sophia, did you know?" My friend Mia leaned in and lowered her voice. "Ethan has had a really rough 6 years." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The day you ran away from the wedding, Ethan lost his mind looking for you, Mia said, swirling her wine glass. But the wedding still happened because Lily showed up in a wedding dress. Already pregnant. I paused, but Mia continued. Mrs. Carter fainted on the spot. After the wedding was canceled, Carter Group's stocks plummeted, and Ethan had to hold up the entire collapsing company on his own. He was out drinking with clients almost every night. She let out a sigh. And Lily? She's been keeping him on a tight leash. One time she even mistook an important business client for a mistress and caused a huge scene. Ethan had to step in and clean up her mess. I took a sip of red wine and said nothing. I heard Lily's getting more paranoid by the day. Another classmate chimed in. She constantly checks Ethan's phone and shows up at his office unannounced. He's practically losing his mind. Just then, the door to our private room swung open. Ethan stepped inside. 6 years had passed. He looked more mature but also visibly worn. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes, and his hair no longer had that pristine, polished look. Though dressed in a dark suit, he couldn't hide the exhaustion that clung to him. Our eyes met across the room. For a moment he hesitated, then a complicated smile crossed his lips. "Sophia," he said, walking toward me. "It's been a long time," I smiled politely. "It has." At that moment, the door was suddenly flung open again. Lily stood at the doorway, her face dark and stormy. She wore a black dress, her makeup meticulously done, yet it couldn't conceal the madness in her eyes. 6 years had passed, and she looked even more haggard than before. The dark circles under her eyes were so deep that not even layers of foundation could cover them. "It really is you," she spat, pointing at me, her voice sharp. "I knew you'd come back to steal my husband." The room fell into an eerie silence. All eyes turned toward us. "Lily." Ethan's expression darkened. "What are you doing?" "What am I doing?" Lily let out a cold laugh and stormed up to me. "Miss Sullivan, do you think acting all high and mighty makes you any less of a husband-stealing whore?" I calmly set my wine glass down and met her gaze with unwavering composure. "Lily, you're mistaken. I have no interest in your husband." "You're lying," she shrieked, suddenly grabbing my wrist. "You've been seducing him all along. Since 6 years ago you," a loud slap cut her off mid-sentence. The entire room froze in shock, including me. Ethan's hand was still trembling. "Lily, don't push me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Don't make me divorce you." Lily stiffened. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she stared at him, her lips trembling. "What did you say?" Ethan took a deep breath and repeated, "Let's get a divorce." Lily's face instantly drained of color. She staggered back, tears spilling from her eyes. "No, you can't do this to me." Suddenly, she lunged forward, clutching onto Ethan's sleeve like a lifeline. "Ethan, have you forgotten? Our child. Do you remember what happened to our child?" Ethan's body tensed visibly. "That day." Lily's voice cracked with sobs. "If you hadn't insisted I go to the hospital for a checkup, if you hadn't made me go alone, our child would still be." Ethan's expression twisted with pain. He closed his eyes as if unwilling to relive that moment. "I hate you," Lily whimpered, her voice growing quieter. "But I love you too. I love you so much." She lifted her tear-filled eyes to look at him, her entire body trembling. "You promised me. You promised you'd take care of me for the rest of my life." Ethan hesitated. His resolve wavered. He reached out to steady Lily, his voice hoarse. "Stop." "No. I won't stop." Lily suddenly became frantic. "Do you have any idea what these years have been like for me? Every single night, I dream of our child. I dream of him calling me mommy." Her voice broke. "But when I wake up, I'm always alone. You're always busy, always out with clients." I was scared, Ethan. I was so scared. Ethan's pain deepened. He held Lily tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry." She sobbed in his arms. "Don't leave me, please." Ethan looked up at me then, his gaze unreadable. For a brief second he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he simply patted Lily's back gently. "Let's go home," he said. I stood frozen, watching them leave together, their figures entwined in an embrace. A storm of emotions churned inside me, anger, regret, relief, and something I couldn't quite name. Mia walked up beside me, lowering her voice. "Are you okay?" I nodded, picked up my wine glass, and downed the rest in one go. "You know," Mia sighed, "there's something about Lily's miscarriage you probably don't know." I arched a brow. "What do you mean?" "I only heard rumors," Mia murmured, glancing around before continuing. That day, Lily didn't go to the hospital for a checkup. She went to see some shady underground doctor to get an abortion. I stared at her in shock. Apparently, Mia went on, she suspected the baby wasn't Ethan's. She was afraid the truth would come out, so... I recalled Ethan's devastated expression when Lily had mentioned their child. Suddenly, I found the whole thing unbearably ironic. I set down my wine glass and turned toward the window, gazing at the dazzling city lights outside. 6 years had passed. We had all changed. Ethan was no longer the ambitious young man he once was. Lily was no longer the sweet, innocent girl from the fishing village. I had no intention of getting involved in their mess. After packing my things, I was ready to leave again when my phone suddenly rang. It was Mrs. Carter. Sophia. Her voice trembled with suppressed sobs. Ethan was hospitalized. He coughed up blood. Can you come see him? I gripped my phone tightly and fell silent. He had saved me twice. The first time was in our past life on the cliffside. He had fallen in my place. The second time was in that car accident when he used his own life to shield me. I sighed. All right, I'll go see him. At the hospital, Ethan lay in bed, his face pale and drained of all color. When he saw me walk in, he forced a weak smile. You're here. I nodded and sat beside him. What happened? He let out a bitter laugh. I found out Lily was cheating on me. I raised an eyebrow. That night, I came home early from a business dinner, he said, his voice hoarse. I heard noises coming from the bedroom. When I opened the door, he shut his eyes as if unwilling to recall the scene. I lost it. I got into a fight with that guy, he muttered, rubbing the bandage on his forehead. You were too impulsive, I said softly. Yeah, he let out a bitter chuckle. But you know what's worse? I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. Ethan's hands trembled slightly. They talked about the miscarriage from years ago. Turns out that child was never mine to begin with, I sighed. What do you plan to do now? Divorce, he said without hesitation. I've already asked my lawyer to draft the papers. At that moment, the hospital room door swung open with a loud bang. Lily stormed in, her face twisted with desperation. Ethan, you can't do this to me. Ethan stared at her coldly. And why not? Lily suddenly dropped to her knees. I saved your life. If it weren't for me, you would have died in that fishing village. Ethan laughed, a hollow, mocking laugh. Lily, if you hadn't noticed my expensive clothes that day, would you still have saved me? Lily froze. You knew who I was from the start, didn't you? His voice turned icy. You didn't save me out of kindness. You wanted to climb higher. No, Lily shook her head frantically. I really loved you. Love? Ethan sneered. Is that why you cheated? Is that why you aborted my child? Lily's face turned deathly pale. Get out, Ethan said, closing his eyes. I don't want to see you again. Lily opened her mouth as if to argue, but when she saw the unyielding determination in Ethan's expression, she broke down into sobs and ran out of the room. Silence filled the air. Ethan turned to me, his gaze unreadable. Sophia. Rest well, I said as I stood up. I should go. Wait, Ethan called after me. When I get discharged, there's something important I need to give you. I wanted to refuse, but when I saw the pleading look in his eyes, I hesitated, then nodded. A week later, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in the city. When I arrived, he was already sitting by the window, waiting. He looked better than he had in the hospital, but the dark circles under his eyes were still prominent. Sophia, he said, standing up and pulling out a chair for me. Thank you for coming. As I sat down, he continued, I've been looking for you all these years. I raised an eyebrow. Looking for me? He smiled bitterly. I know you didn't want to see me, but still Ethan, interrupted, my tone firm. Let the past stay in the past. I'm doing well now, really. He lowered his head, then pulled a small box from his pocket and slid it across the table toward me. I opened the box. I froze. It was the jade pendant. The smooth jade gleamed softly under the sunlight, exactly as I remembered it. I found it buried in a pile of junk at home, Ethan said quietly. It was already broken, so I clumsily tried to fix it. Judging by the craftsmanship, repairing the pendant must have been extremely difficult. He must have put a lot of effort into it. I picked up the pendant, examining it carefully. The surface still bore the small cracks and dents from all those years ago. That day, Ethan's voice was slightly choked. Lily didn't lose it by accident. She threw it away on purpose. I nodded. I know. You knew? Yeah. I set the pendant down. Ethan clutched it tightly. I held on to it because it was proof that you once loved me. Pain flickered in his eyes. I'm sorry, he murmured. You don't need to apologize, I said calmly. It's all in the past. I pushed the pendant back toward him. Do me a favor, throw it away for me, he stiffened. But this pendant holds our memories. Those memories don't mean anything to me anymore, I said, standing up. Ethan, we both need to move forward. Leaving the cafe, I stood by the roadside, waiting for a cab. The golden hues of the setting sun cast a warm glow over everything. Suddenly, the sharp roar of an engine pierced the air. I turned my head just in time to see a red sports car hurtling toward me at full speed. Lily. Her face was contorted, her eyes filled with madness. Die, she shrieked. Without you, Ethan will finally be mine. I froze. My body felt paralyzed, unable to react. Just as the car was about to hit me, a figure lunged toward me, Ethan. He shoved me aside with all his strength. The next thing I knew, his body was sent flying through the air, crashing onto the pavement with a sickening thud. A loud bang echoed as the car skidded and slammed into a lamppost. Ethan, I screamed, scrambling toward him. He lay on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, staining his white shirt. His trembling hand reached out, struggling to touch my face. Sophia, are you okay? I'm fine. I choked, grasping his hand tightly. Don't talk, the ambulance is coming. Lily staggered out of the car, her face pale as a sheet. I didn't mean to, I just wanted to scare her. Shut up, I roared. You lunatic. Within minutes, the ambulance and police arrived. Ethan was lifted onto a stretcher, unconscious. At the hospital, Ethan was rushed into the ICU. I sat on a bench in the corridor, my entire body trembling. This scene was too familiar, just like in our past life. Lily was taken away by the police, facing the punishment she deserved. Mrs. Carter arrived in a hurry. When she saw me, she stopped in her tracks. Sophia. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stood up. Auntie, I'm sorry. She shook her head, taking my hand. The ones who should be apologizing are us. We held each other and cried. Ethan's fate remained uncertain. At that moment, his personal diary was leaked online. It contained every memory of us from our past. Sitting outside the ICU, my phone buzzed relentlessly with messages. Sophia, have you seen the news? Ethan's diary went viral online. Oh my God, I didn't know you two had such a beautiful past. He really, truly loved you. I opened my phone. The top trending topic was Ethan Carter's high school memories. I clicked in and saw excerpts from his diary. Sophia was sick today. I sneaked into her room and stayed by her side all night. She looks so peaceful when she sleeps, like a little kitten. Sophia said she wanted a cake from a bakery across town. I spent the whole day searching for it, but when I saw her smile, I knew it was worth it. We had once promised each other, under the cherry blossom tree, that we would be together forever. Sophia, I will spend my whole life keeping that promise. I stared at the words in his diary, yet my heart felt nothing. Those beautiful memories had long since faded with time, turning into dust. 3 days later, Ethan was finally out of danger. When I entered the hospital room, he was sitting up against the headboard. His face was pale, but his spirit seemed high. You're here, he said with a small smile. I nodded and sat down beside his bed. How are you feeling? It's okay, he said. Just a little painful. I looked at his bandaged body and whispered, Thank you for saving me. He shook his head. It's what I should have done. A brief silence stretched between us before he spoke again, his voice soft. Sophia, have you read my diary? I nodded. His gaze turned complicated. Do you still remember those memories? I smiled faintly. I do, but they're in the past now. He froze. The past? Yes, I said calmly. They were beautiful memories, but that's all they are, just memories. Desperation flickered across his face as he grabbed my hand. Sophia, I know I was wrong. I know now that I never touched Lily that night, and after the wedding I never gave us a real chance. Can we start over? I looked at him and spoke softly. Ethan, we've both changed. No, he said, his voice rising with emotion. I haven't changed. I still love you. I shook my head. No, Ethan, you've changed and so have I. Sophia. His voice carried a plea. I stood up. Ethan, I stopped loving you a long time ago. His head shot up, his eyes filled with anguish. You really don't love me anymore? I hesitated for a moment before replying gently. I once loved you very much. But now, I love my freedom more. I love the world more. He shut his eyes and a single tear slipped down his cheek. I turned and walked toward the door. Just as I reached it, I heard his quiet voice behind me. Be happy. I turned back and gave him a genuine smile. You too. As I stepped out of the hospital, the sun shone brilliantly overhead. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than ever before. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my guide in Iceland. The northern lights are appearing. Do you want to come see them? I smiled as I typed my response. On my way. This was my life. Free, independent, full of endless possibilities. As for Ethan, I glanced back at the hospital window. He was standing there, looking at me, raising his hand in farewell. I lifted my hand and waved back softly. Then, without hesitation, I turned and walked into the sunlight. The world was vast. There were still so many places to go, so many sights to see. This time, I would live for myself,